All right, welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Christina. I'm the Office Manager and Communications Coordinator for the Melissa Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to the next installment of our Innovations in Violence Prevention and Treatment series. We teamed up with Dr. Lisa Goodman and the Community Action and Human Services Department of Miami-Dade County to bring you a course that we truly feel is filled with not only important information, but also with the opportunity to step out of the box and find interventions that will be useful and progressive for your organization and any survivors that cross your path. I would like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. This course is going to be a little bit different than how we've done it in the past, but we're excited to offer a more hands-on approach to these dialogues. There will be some breakout sessions to discuss application in smaller groups after the presentation, but we definitely encourage you to use the chat to communicate with each other, exchange ideas. And if you have any direct questions for the presenter, panelists, or any of us, you can select TMI Help Desk from the users in the chat and send me a direct message. And I'll make sure to get those questions over to them. Also, please take note that I will have some survey and poll questions popping out throughout the session, and we really love and appreciate your feedback. So thank you again for joining us, and I would like to now pass the stage over to Executive Director of the Melissa Institute, Dr. Etione Alvarado.
Good morning, all of you. I want to start by saying thank you and congratulations to all of you. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations for making such a wise choice to come in today to listen to Lisa and participate and interact with Lisa Goodman. I am the director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment, and for the past, many of you have joined us in many other events, and you may have heard us say that since in the last 2.5 years, we have had the pleasure of providing services, resources to over 50,000 individuals from over 130 countries. We're very proud of the work that we're doing. We're very proud of the reach and happy to be connected and collaborating with so many of you. As you know, the Institute, some of you know, the Institute is dedicated to the use of science for the prevention and treatment of violence and its victims. And everything that we do for free. And all we ask is that you use the knowledge that we share with you to help us repair the world, and that you consider here and there, when the moment is right, make a donation to the Institute. That is how we get to do this and all the other activities that the Institute does through the year. Today we have with us Lisa Goodman. And Lisa, and you have the bio in your documents, professor of counseling psychology at Boston College and distinguished scholar in the field of violence prevention, particularly issues related to violence against women. And now, but Lisa and I have known each other since 1989. And so we had the pleasure of knowing each other since our graduate school years. And we have watched each other grow during this time, help each other move along in our careers. We were colleagues at Boston College at one point too. And some of our happiest memories are from that time. And I'm so glad to have you with us, Lisa. Thank you for agreeing to share with you your recent work. Thanks.
Thank you. So am I on, Christina? Okay, and at some point you'll open up the slide. Let me just start by saying thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. I'm an admirer of the Melissa Institute and the work that you all do. And I want to also thank you, Christina. You've done such an incredibly complicated job to bring us to this moment. And yes, Etione and I go way back. I always laugh because I was the one who would fetch and complain at every step of the way, and Etione was the one who would not. So I sought him out a lot. Like, how do I not see this as unjust? So it's good to be with you in this way, Etione. So Christina, are you gonna open up the, great. Perfect. So a few housekeeping details before I start. My plan is to talk with you all for maybe 35 minutes. I have found that I no longer have the capacity to listen to people much after that. And my bet is that some of you will be tired of hearing my voice after that as well. But more importantly, I really want to give you all the chance to take the observations that I'm going to convey to you from the survivors I've talked with and think about how you can use them in your work every day and talk to your colleagues about what could be different because you've heard this information. And then we'll come back and talk about those ideas and think about them together. So that's the plan. We'll have breakouts and then return. So next slide, please. Thank you. I just want to start out by acknowledging the people who did this study, this project with me, including the people you can just read for yourselves, the people on the who were the co-researchers, and then also the people who were board members, and I'll tell you about them in a second, and then or in a few minutes. And then the 25 women who shared their stories and who are the basis of what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to start with what prompted this project. The murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, as you all know, expanded an urgent and ongoing national conversation about the harms that arise at the intersection of race and policing. And much of this conversation emphasized the need to develop more community-based interventions for situations that often elicit a police response simply in the absence of any alternative. So I'm thinking about situations like homelessness or mental health challenges, substance use, and though this is more complicated, also violent crimes. Within the domestic violence field, these conversations have ignited a really fierce self-reflection, especially among those who have not fully understood the race-based harms that permeate the criminal legal system and how those harms affect survivors and their families. And this self-reflection, in turn, has catalyzed activists and advocates to take a hard look at some long-standing ideas about how to best respond to domestic violence. And just one example of this shift can be seen in this declaration called the Moment of Truth, Statement of Commitment to Black Lives. This was a statement signed by 46 domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions who denounced the way the movement has relied so heavily on police and prosecutors and prisons as the primary solution to domestic violence. You can see when you link to many domestic violence programs, the thing they say across the banner at the front is hang up and call 911 if you need to. This has been the sort of primary automatic response. Anyway, this document called on all of us to account for the ways this strategy has failed survivors, particularly survivors of color. And the statement calls for a shift away from the criminal legal system in favor of community solutions like restorative justice, transformative justice. So we have a growing interest in community solutions, but what we have lacked are systematic data from survivors themselves, especially regarding this moment of intense danger when the police are most likely to be called. What do survivors do in these moments already? And what do they want? So as we continue to consider ways to expand community options, my little group thought it was critical to hear from survivors in response to this growing conversation. Next slide, please. So the study questions that we set out to learn more about are, one, who do survivors already reach out to in moments of danger, separate and apart from whether they also call the police? And then second, what factors across individual, interpersonal, and contextual levels influence survivors' goals and decisions in these moments? Okay, Yes, thank you. So what do we already know? There are two streams of scholarship that kind of inform this project. First, we already know from the research a lot about survivors' use of informal networks in non-emergency moments. And at the bottom are a list of just a few of the authors who have taught us what we know. We know that survivors lean on informal networks before, during, and instead of formal support already. So for example, there was one study of 114 white, Latinx, and Black survivors receiving domestic violence services across 4 metropolitan areas, and it found that 94% had sought informal support before turning to formal services. That's a very recent study, Shannon Park. But we've also learned that survivors often seek informal support reluctantly, fearing that networks are exhausted and fed up with them, or feeling shame or worry about being misunderstood or judged, or wanting to feel strong and independent. And then, of course, sometimes survivors don't reach out at all. And we also know that sometimes network members are helpful and sometimes they're not. But what about in a moment of danger? As far as we know, there had not been much systematic research on that question. So we wanted to just begin to illuminate that particular question. One more slide about what we already know. A second strand of research has demonstrated that advocates are really hungry for more attention to survivors' informal support networks, consistent with the Moment of Truth Declaration. In one study I conducted with some colleagues, we interviewed almost every single advocate in one northeastern state in the form of focus groups, and found that most had tried to practice some form of what we started to call a network-oriented approach. So that means practices designed to strengthen survivors' relationships with people in their networks in ways that support their healing and safety and well-being. Things like helping survivors identify helpful and harmful network members, helping them find new ways to engage with friends and families, often after a period of being isolated by their partner, or helping them develop new relationships when old ones were simply not available. And then also working directly with people in their networks to help them, like friends and family, to help them support survivors more effectively. But even though they were doing a lot of that work already, it was not work that was kind of assigned to them. It was not legitimated. There was no funding stream for it. Rather, it was work that they kind of did around the edges when they had time. Driving somebody to a church where their own religion was practiced, or where they felt that there was somebody who shared their immigrant status, whatever. Almost to a person, these advocates that we interviewed wanted to center this kind of work more, but often felt that they were just unable to, and they wanted more training in how to do it and more dedicated time to it. So I say all that just to say that the door is open for this kind of work, but it has not been centered in the work of I think most domestic violence programs. So next slide, please. Yeah. So 3 ideas framed our own approach. One, we wanted to elicit the perspective of survivors themselves. We wanted to highlight their experience and their recommendations. And in particular, we wanted to ensure a strong representation of survivors of color, given their centrality in discussions of the harms of policing. And so to do this, we partnered with a range of community programs, and I'll tell you where they're from in a minute. We have now already given feedback to each of these programs so they know what their own participants are seeking, and we're working with some of them to build on these findings. And then we also wanted insight from a range of stakeholders as we developed the study. So we did this in 2 ways. First, we conducted a focus group with a very large group of advocates at one of our partnering programs. There were 22 people, and they helped us frame the right question to ask, sort of the open, how do you get into this complex set of stories and questions. So he sort of helped us frame how to do that. And I'll show you our opening question in a second. And then we also formed an advisory group comprised of scholars, policymakers, and survivors from across the country. And we periodically sought their input, especially on how to interpret our findings. And then last, we took a relational and ecological approach, seeking to understand in depth the participants' decision-making in the context of their perceptions of themselves, their relationships, and their social context. So it was not enough to ask, who did you reach out to? But why? Why at this moment, and why in the broader context of your life? So that's why the data got kind of complex. So moving very directly into the study itself, we worked with community partners in Indianapolis, in New York, Kentucky, and Massachusetts. And to recruit participants, advocates in each of those places sent out flyers. Survivors who were interested then reached out to us by phone or text or email. We interviewed, in the end, 25 participants in a very in-depth way. You can look at their demographics right here. And I'll just note that 20 of them had spent some time in shelter. So this is largely a sample of survivors who have needed shelter, and that is a frame for the findings. Everyone was paid $50, and I conducted all of the interviews via Zoom, often with another member of our research team, and sometimes not. Next slide, please. So the question that the focus group helped us start with was, I'm going to ask you to think about times when you or your children were deeply scared and unsafe because of your partner, when the situation went beyond your capacity to deal with it on your own and it felt like a real emergency. And then we would ask, can you tell me about the first time it felt like that? And then the scariest, and then the most recent. And often we got much more than that. And then we would follow up these stories with, who did you reach out to and why, and what happened, and is this what you wanted? And the why sort of extended beyond, as I said, the immediate moment. So in terms of how the participants described the real emergency that we asked about, they generally described a moment of like dangerous change in their partner's behavior, like when the violence suddenly became more severe, or when the partner just totally lost control, or when the participant felt suddenly and completely powerless because of the partner's actions. So that's the kind of core experience that they wanted to tell us about, the first, the most severe, and the most recent. And by the way, you can imagine that this was a hard interview, and we spent a lot of time gauging how the interviewees were doing in the moment of the interview, and making sure that they were grounded and okay and wanted to continue. It was a trauma-informed interview, and there was a lot of training involved for the people that did them with me. Next slide, please. So in terms of the police and what they said about the police, about 3/4 of this sample did call the police at least once in an emergency moment. Some called the police as a first resort, and some as an absolute last resort. This is interesting. Those who reached out to their informal networks sometimes also called the police and sometimes did not. And the same was true for those who felt that they didn't have anyone to reach out to in terms of their informal networks. I think what's really important here is that there was no association between the strength of a survivor's informal networks. Correlation is the wrong word, by the way. That's like a quant word. This is a qualitative study, but there was no seeming association between the strength of a survivor's informal network and her decision to call the police in a moment of acute danger. We know that survivors often prefer not to rely on the police, so we might have expected that those with a stronger network would call the police less often. And that did not turn out to be the case, which suggests the possibility that even the best informal network may not be sufficient to address every instance of acute violence. And of course, that makes intuitive sense, since informal networks are not trained or equipped to intervene in violent situations. But as we will discuss later, this finding really encourages us to explore alternatives that would give survivors additional options that are neither informal network nor the police. And we'll come back to what participants said about that. So let's move to what survivors did when they did not call the police. So as the slide indicates, a full half of the participants reached out to no one, either most or all of the time. I'm going to come back to that central idea in a second. But I'll say now that this finding brings to light something that really had been obscured in the prior research that I reviewed at the beginning, because that research revealed that most survivors rely heavily on informal networks. Remember, I said before, during, and after outreach to formal networks like the police. But our study was consistent with that, because most participants did reach out at least once to informal networks. But those prior studies focused on what survivors did do in general. They didn't systematically ask what survivors do each time, separate time that they need help. So taking this kind of a systematic approach about each time helped us to understand specific and concrete responses to violent events across time. And that approach provided this new and I think really important insight that even for those survivors who had reached out over the course of their relationship to friends and family and neighbors, they also experienced plenty of dire emergency moments when they did not feel able to contact anyone from their informal networks, not anyone. And that is really sobering. But still, most did reach out to someone at least some of the time, mainly to family members, friends, neighbors, and their choices were based on the following criteria in order. To a person, they said they wanted someone who would not judge. And I think this finding was really striking, given that one might expect a preference for a more action-oriented response in an acutely dangerous moment, but this was very much not the case. And then back to that too. They wanted, second, people who were in positions to provide practical assistance, like having a place for the survivor to stay or a car to pick her up. And I am using these pronouns, she and her pronouns, because the survivors in this particular study were all women. And they wanted someone who lived close by. Like some talk with great affection about people who live further away, but wouldn't be able to help them in those emergency moments. So what did they receive when they did reach out? Next slide, please. So many network responses they described as painful, discrediting the survivor, refusing to provide help, telling the survivor what to do, or conditioning assistance on leaving the relationship. You know what I mean by that? You know, like, I'm so sick of helping you. If you're not going to get out, I don't want to, I can't do this anymore, kind of thing. And others provided useful practical help, like a place to stay, transportation, coming to a scene to just be there, to sort of indicate that, like, I see you, you can't do this, or very occasionally calling the police. And a very few provided the kind of non-judgmental listening that participants named as what they were seeking. So they wanted it the most and got it kind of the least. So now we get to this question of what influences on this process were important to them. This is going to be the complex part, and I think the most important. Why is it that most participants felt they had no one to call most of the time? And why is it that when they did reach out, so many of their responses did not feel good? So many of the network responses did not feel good. One thing they talked about a great deal is pre-existing family rupture. The first thing participants often said in response to the question, so if you didn't call someone, why not, had to do with that. And that was in a variety of ways. They talked about, one, something that had to do with intergenerational trauma. Like, a lot of participants noted that people in their lives, their mothers, their grandmothers, their siblings, and their friends had themselves suffered violent victimization, including child abuse and neglect, partner violence, sexual assault within their families. And in some families, this resulted, they said, in a desensitization, like kind of like these things just happen. As one participant described it, my grandma, she stayed with a man that was abusing her. My dad, he stayed with a woman that was abusing him. My sister is still married to a guy that is abusing her. And it's like a family pattern. It was always, you got to work it out. You got to stick with it. They never tell you how to leave. So I kept things quiet for a long time. And then for others, this intergenerational trauma rendered their support networks too emotionally overwhelmed to really listen in a meaningful way, according to the survivors. So one person described this experience as like a constant triggering. She said, I wouldn't call my mother because it would just trigger her and she wouldn't be able to help me. She needs to heal before I can heal. And they also described, so that was the sort of intergenerational trauma piece. A lot of them also described systemic intrusion. And by that, I mean stories about child protective services splitting up their families in ways that they never recovered from. And so they didn't really have anyone to call because they were so splintered. And then less frequently, they described disruptions due to conditions like addiction or incarceration or homelessness, and then physical distance. And I want to really note that although more people talked about that, then talked about family strength, there were people who talked about my family was there for me. My brother did come. We have a really tight family. So I don't want to sort of overlook that very important theme, but it was not the dominant theme among the participants that we interviewed. So that was one set of influences, family rupture. The next set had to do with explicit network messages. So even if there was someone in their life, sometimes the participants did not feel that they could reach out because of the messages they received from their networks that they heard. I don't know what was actually conveyed, who knows, but they heard as the network tolerating domestic violence as a necessary evil. You heard a little bit of that from the quote I gave you. Or networks lacking an understanding of these dynamics, or blaming them for inciting or provoking the violence, or disbelieving them and or believing the partner more, or disapproving of, being disappointed by or fed up with survivors' decisions related to safety. Again, there were some really good, important exceptions, often best friends from earlier in life, or in one case, this brother who just got it. And this woman said, he would just send me messages all the time that you are valuable, you are worth something, you are loved. But again, these were the exceptions. Then another set of influences had to do with, now we're moving into the survivor herself and her own experience, the survivor's orientation to relationships. So the way we sort of conceptualize this is the family ruptures and network messages sort of in turn created in most of the survivors this set of limiting self-images in terms of how they saw themselves in relation to other people. There's a term in literature called relational images, sort of, which is what I just said, how people see relationships and themselves in them. And these relational images contributed to a tendency to withdraw rather than reach out, even in emergency moments. So about half of the sample described a sense of really very profound aloneness. One participant said, I felt alone, I guess because I felt like nobody truly knows my story. And many expressed profound distrust of other people, like not seeing them as dependable or seeing them as out to take advantage of other people's vulnerabilities. You know, one person said, people don't always want to be a good person. They don't always have your best interests in mind. Some wanted to avoid the shame they felt that came with looking weak to others. So one woman said, I didn't want to involve my family in it because I wanted to portray myself to them as being an independent person. I was embarrassed. I didn't want people to think that I would tolerate that. It's embarrassing because people knew me to be a strong person, a smart person, someone that didn't take crap. I didn't want people to look down on me. And then I said, and that weighed stronger than the desire to get help in an emergency. And she said, at that time, yes. For many, or actually for most of the Black women in the study, the cultural stereotype of the strong Black woman contributed to their personal desire to appear resilient and independent. And many simply did not want to burden anyone in their networks. Like, as one put it, not the way I am. Not now, not the way I am. And then again, the exception of participants who would reached out to friends from a long time ago. They said in the emergency moment, I just thought of my best friend who I got out of touch with, and I knew she would get my story and she would listen without judgment. And, and then I wanted to say a word about their reaching out to me and my co-interviewer, which to me was an indication of their ability to connect and their willingness to connect if they only had a person to connect to, because they were very, very authentic and sort of obviously wanting to form connection with us, the interviewers, and often asked if we could talk again. And it was obvious that they were not closed off, almost with one or two exceptions. These survivors were not at all closed off to the possibility of connection. Next slide, please. Oh, we are on it. Yes. So sense of mattering. Again, at the individual level, at the core, many of the survivors did not reach out because they did not feel they mattered to anyone. They described not being important to network members, not being seen by network members, and not being cherished or loved. And you see a quote that is an exception to that. Next slide, please. So just to summarize a little bit, looping back to the top, most survivors describe this damaging cycle of intergenerational trauma, systemic intrusion, usually in the form of child protective services, followed by negative messages from networks alongside relational orientations that really pushed for disconnection, all leading to and following from a sense of not mattering to anyone. So in the dangerous moment, when survivors were terrified and unable to manage on their own, they often had nowhere to turn, or when they did try to reach out, they often had these negative patterns reinforced by the reaction of their network members. So now I want to turn to, I'm just whizzing through all of this so we can get to what you all think, but I want to turn now to what they wished for. So in the face of all this, we asked participants, what would you want in that dangerous moment? And what do you need? I think this is really important. Many did not know. In fact, they said things like, how could I know? In that moment, their heads were spinning. They felt they were having an out-of-body experience. They couldn't think. And I want to read to you this quote that illustrates what a number of people said. She said, this is the best thing that comes to my mind. If I'm a baby and I busted my head open and I'm walking around and people are just looking at my head busted open and I'm sitting up there and I'm just walking around with a busted head, I don't realize what's going on because I can't see it. I know it hurts, but if I never get that care for it, it's like I'm going to die. I don't even know how to go to somebody and say, hey, my head is busted. It's just unaware. It's oblivious. I couldn't tell people that I needed them to care. I just literally did not care about myself. For you clinicians in the meeting, I think it's a really good description of dissociation. So then I asked, even at that moment of danger, you couldn't see what was happening? Yes, even in that moment. But at the same time, I want to say that many could also say very clearly what they needed. And their responses fell into several different categories. First, they wanted physical safety and respite through someone helping him to calm down. Their partners were men, help calming him down, someone to pick her up, someone to give her a safe place for a day or two. And then they also wanted psychological respite through someone to be able to listen without judgment and with empathy. More specifically, many describe wishing for someone to listen in a very particular way, to reflect the survivor's experience back to her in a way that would help her understand herself, to respond to what she needed once she could figure that out with them, and not what they needed for her. So survivors described in really glowing terms how transformative it was when a friend or family member listened carefully, stayed with the survivor's perspective, and expressed love and a sense of survivor's value. This was by far the most cross-cutting and pervasive idea, and a surprising one, I think, that even in the most dangerous moment, even when the survivor's life was in danger, when she said she needed, what she said she needed was for someone to listen. So I would ask, even when you were like in the bathroom with the door locked and he was banging on the door, then you wanted someone to listen? Yes, right then. And I want to give you this quote to illustrate this by a woman who eventually was able to receive emotional support at the emergency moment from a sibling. She said, "He gave me the type of help that I needed, just to hear his voice, just to know that somebody still loved me out there." They, by that she means the harming partner, they find whatever weakness and whatever insecurities that you have, and they tear each one of those things apart to a point for somebody like me, who I knew I had good self-esteem, can make you feel like the smallest particle of dirt on the ground. Sometimes just to hear that's not how everybody thinks that about you. It's everything in the world. It's an empowerment. It gives you strength to say, it's the first step to say, wait a minute, everything that you're saying to me is wrong. Maybe I should leave. Maybe you're not right. And I asked, as I kept asking at the beginning, because I couldn't quite get it, wait, that's what you needed at the moment of greatest danger? And she said, I guess it helps you to stop for a minute, to rethink and regroup. You know how when Popeye the Sailor Man is getting weak and he's in a fight and he gets that spinach, then he gets this internal strength. It gives you that mental and emotional strength to reevaluate the situation and sometimes figure out, is this a fight or flight situation? Can I de-escalate? How would I do that? I don't know how to explain it. It can help you get the strength to even call the police or just get out of the situation or whatever. It gave me strength. It gave me a serenity, a calmness to at least stop my part in the situation. I was able to calm down and quiet myself to self-reflect on some stuff. I think that was the starting point of me forming an escape plan. And then one more quick quote to illustrate the same point. Another person said, I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for a place to stay. I was really asking for someone just to hold space for me to think. And so what is so crucial here is that for many participants, this kind of support, truly listening, holding space for me to think, was in short supply or even completely unavailable, at least in their perception. The reality that these women had no friends or family to turn to, even when their lives were at stake, is, I think, a matter of really profound concern. And leads to the next slide, which is recommendations. And these are recommendations from the survivors. And so, you know, I'm hoping that we can build on these survivor recommendations as we think about, you know, what would work in your particular agency. I think this sort of full range of recommendations is especially important given our finding about the dependence on the police, regardless of network strength being still, you know, the police being very widely used, irrespective of network strength. So participants suggested new areas for survivor-defined practice in several different areas. First, new arenas, I'm sorry. First, increase the capacity of existing members to listen empathically, to understand survivors' needs, to know how to play a role in dangerous moments that is aligned with what survivors need. And survivors talked about how this could happen. They describe building network capacity through workshops or groups for network members, opportunities for dialogue between the survivor and one or two of their network members, like mother and daughter pairs or survivor plus network member of her choice. They also talked about creating a buddy approach when this is what for survivors, especially who didn't feel like any of their network members would be good candidates for work. A buddy approach where DV programs could bring together pairs of survivors to work together to develop mutual trust and specific strategies they could use with each other in moments of crisis. And before we get to the third one, I want to just really note that these first two in many ways echo some amazing work that is already going on. First, in the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, led by disability activist Mia Mingus, who are doing work on pod mapping. So in their model, a pod is a set of people you can turn to for support in the face of violent, harmful, or abusive experiences. And the pod could be survivors or bystanders or people even who have harmed. And Mingus has a pod mapping worksheet so that survivors can think about who they trust, who they would want, all well in advance. And you can see that in chat. And another amazing initiative that overlaps with both of these recommendations, again, is the Chat Project, Collective Healing and Transformation Project, also in Northern California, Go California. And this is a restorative justice project that resides in the community, does not interact at all with the criminal legal system, and works to help survivors of violence, their community allies, and also sometimes the person who caused the harm, to come together in circles for the purpose of having a safe and meaningful face-to-face dialogue. So obviously neither of these brilliant interventions are about the moment of greatest harm. They are about building capacity for that moment. And that's really what the first two suggestions are on their survivors' recommendations are as well. The last one is about the emergency moment in particular. A lot of them separately, I didn't bring it up, talked about a very similar idea, which is a lot of them said they would never, they thought they would never go to a shelter, and they ended up going only because, well, for various reasons, which I can get into later. But what they longed for was a new form of physical respite. They hated the paperwork and rules and intake processes of a shelter. They hated the labeling of, abuse survivor that comes with going to a shelter. And what they talked about is a place they could go for a few days without all that stuff, to think, to decompress, to regain their bearings, to figure out next steps, to get that kind of listening that they needed so much. Maybe with an advocate who could say, here's my number, call me if and when you want, but go take care of your kids, go to sleep, no paperwork. So I thought that was an idea, a really, really important idea expressed by a number of people. So in sum, what do survivors wish for? They want an opportunity to slow down and think with someone, even in the most dangerous of moments. People talked about like hiding in a hedge, keeping the door locked, buried, desk in front of the door as a barricade. All different kinds of moments when they had a second, and that what they wanted to do is call someone who would listen that way, whether it was a friend or a family member, someone who gets it, or an advocate in the context of a place to stay. And I will say that they wouldn't mind it being a number of people at the end, I asked them about it, they would not mind it being the police. It's just that is rarely what they got from the police. And there were one or two exceptions where they said the police offered the best listening ear they had. One described a police came with another, two people came, a man and a woman. One person took the harming partner away, the other sat with her, played with her kids, said, we have time, think about what you want. That doesn't usually happen with the police, but it is the function of a listening ear is what they want. And I think that that is so simple and yet so complex. So I hope that we have provided in this talk a little bit of infrastructure for thinking about what might help in your community. And if you could just forward it one more slide, Christina. What we were hoping to do next is some breakouts where you can have a chance to think about what resonated with you the most about this talk. What have you seen among survivors in your programs or in your own life? And what is the first step to build on what resonated with you? Or what steps have you already taken and how could you do even more in your organizations? How might you talk to survivors differently? What kinds of new meetings might you have, like with survivors and their mothers or whatever? What kinds of new questions could you ask in a staff meeting or in your own family, in your own life? So that's all for me now. And then Christina, I think I'm going to give it back to you to set up these breakouts.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa, so much for that wealth of information. Lots of powerful stories that you shared with us. Thank you with that. Now we're going to break into groups to dig a little deeper, like Lisa said, on how we can apply these interventions into our organizations right away. So we're going to separate you into random groups of about 8 people, 7 to 8, and you're going to be given 15 minutes to discuss what resonated from today's presentation, and building on that, what next step might you take in your organization or practice. I'm going to set up a timer, a 60-second timer that will pop up to advise you when the breakout sessions are about to end, and then it'll pull everyone back into this room. Make sure that the first thing you do is appoint a note taker for the group, and that person will be the one to present ideas and speak for the group when we come back. As always, if you have any questions, make sure to send a DM directly to TMI Help Desk. And if you Robin, I'm about to unmute you, and she's representing breakout room number 5.
Okay, so what we thought was we really do a lot of this work already. Like we really try to focus to be victim-centered and victim-focused. Drawing a line between empowering versus enabling is always a struggle, to do that. How to get all of the other people you work with to be as empathetic and as caring, because sometimes, those silos develop and it's very hard to get other people on board to be able to hold space with people where they are and support them where they are without putting in their own biases and their own thoughts into the process. The ability to build trust that, for some of us, it could happen over time. And for others, it has to happen right away because we need to help them in crisis. And then one of our members shared that they do host families where they bring people into their home and they establish these amazing relationships and connections, talking about the respite care that they actually need in Miami. Amazing work they're doing there. So that's what we discussed.
Could I ask a question? Is that okay? Hi, Robin.
Hi.
A couple of things. First of all, can you just say a little bit more about what you mean about the family respite care? Or I don't know, the person who does that?
Is that actually, if she's on, I don't know, I didn't get her name, but she has a program out of Miami, and they take people, domestic violence and children, into their homes and keep them for 5 weeks to give them that respite care to separate them from what's going on, which that's, incredible grassroots work. I see it as, but if she pops on and she'll tell you what her name is, she could tell you more about her program.
Great. Maybe if that person is still here and wants to put any information in
Sonia, is that you?
Oh, there it is.
Okay,
Safe
perfect. Let me
Families for
unmute you.
Children.
It's
Yeah.
me.
So in our group, what we came up was with that it's so important that the domestic survivors, what they wanted most was to not feel judged and to feel that they could speak freely, and versus seeking safety, which was what we thought would be at the top of their list. So that is important to, from the get-go, discuss seeking safety while also being non-judgmental in your stance.
Okay.
I'm just curious, Sonia, and or anybody who was in that first group. I see that it's
I
Juliana.
unmuted the wrong person. So if I can actually bring up Juliana, so she's going to discuss directly. 1 second.
Okay, great. And then I would love to hear also from Sonia, whether the I really appreciate the sort of your recognition of the complexity of both of you, of like listening without judgment. It's really hard. But also whether you've done any work, either of you, on extending that to helping network members do that sort of non-judgmental listening. But I would love to hear also from Julia. Juliana, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Well, I'm so excited to be here and listen all the studies that you did with the victims, because we really say Families for Children is about listening and care and being that relationship piece that it's not only for domestic violence. We serve any kind of family that is in crisis. We want to have the wraparound care, for that family so they can get back on their feet, prevent them more children go to foster care. We are a prevention measure, and it's a volunteer-driven movement. So when I talked about hosting, I hosted a family, a mom and from domestic violence and a child, a 10-year-old child, for 5 weeks. And I saw what you said about having the safe place for them to decompress, to think, and we connect that family to the resources. And I befriend that mom still. She moved from Miami. I visit her the other day, and she's doing well because she had that relationship piece, because they need, of course, resources, concrete support, but they need just a listening ear. So Safe Families for Children, we are a volunteer-driven movement. We are in the United States. Here in Miami, we have been here just for two years. But the struggle I was sharing with my colleague is that it's a volunteer-driven movement. So to find volunteers, we can find volunteers to befriend, to coach a mom, to be the resources, but to be host families, it's harder. It's a hard ask. So we have our capacity in Miami. We're just building capacity. We have just a few host families in Miami willing, and most of them, they are willing to host a child and not the whole family. But we have 2 families, host families here that already had the experience of hosting the mom and the child, like I did, and the other lady here that did as well. So I don't know if I answered most of the questions, but it's a very, I love Safe Families for Children because we are relationship. We walk with them, they're not alone in their crisis. We are listening ears. That's what we do.
I just have to note how amazing I think that is, because it's exactly that third thing that survivors asked for, a place to go that is not a shelter, that's like a real, that is a place where we can decompress and nobody's going to make us fill out an intake and give us a set of rules. It never even occurred to me that it could be with a family. Like, it never occurred to them to even ask for that. So I find that incredibly moving and a fantastic model. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'm putting in here, if you want to look more, it's a national organization. So it's there, the website, so you can take a look and see. We have in different states. Maybe, people here from different states want to connect to the directors in your city, see how you can collaborate. And it's all about collaboration, because we are not a housing program. We're not a financial assistant. We're not a legal service. We are people, just volunteers who want to walk out with people and help them, like maybe transport them to a doctor's appointment, a lawyer, babysitting sometimes, it's an easy model, but you guys have all the other stuff that we need, right? When we have a mom that needs a legal assistance, who we're going to look for collaborations, for partners. And I think the secret is us to work together,
And mentioning collaboration, someone did drop a gem of an idea of building a networking list with all the participants that attended today. So that would be really great to find ways to connect you guys more. I'll work on that.
If I may say, to piggyback a little bit on Juliana, I see that a lot of families that are going through DV are seeking for divorce and support with legal services. So I work for Bridging Families and Communities, which is part of the Advocate Program. I'm the clinician on board, and we focus on providing support through the family court system to parents who are high conflict or domestic violence victims. So we're always taking referrals. So if you guys need any assistance, we're here. Thank you.
And there was a hand raised. I think it was Yaneth. I don't know if you still, but just before we go on to the next person, I thought it might be in response to what was already said.
Well, she can definitely respond and then go ahead and talk about her group because she's representing a breakout room as well. So there we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay. I was like, I can't unmute. Thank you. Yeah, no, my question was answered when Juliana put up the link. I actually just sent it to all my ASAs right now so that they have as an additional resource. So our group, of course, I have someone knocking as soon as I have to speak. Our group, sorry, he has my little morning coffee. I needed that. Oh, I'm in a training.
As human.
Do you want? I'm in a training. Sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. Okay. So they're worse than children sometimes. Okay. So our group talked about incorporating some of the listening and pairing of survivors to help one another. I thought that was actually really, really beneficial. So we talked a little bit about that. And then the listening ear exercise and the pod mapping. A lot of us had pulled up the link for it and to see what it looked like and create the little actual maps. So we thought that could be very beneficial, specifically the pairing of survivors and the buddy approach. So we thought we could incorporate some of that.
Awesome.
Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to call on Melanie.
Hi, everyone. I have no idea what group I was in, spokesperson fail, but we talked about a lot of what resonated with us, and we talked a lot about keeping in the forefront of your mind the importance of listening, validating the survivor's experience, recognizing that this is their truth before providing any feedback or resources, trusting them that they know how to take care of themselves, that listening to what they need from their mouths versus assuming that we know what's best. We also talked about, at times, yes, we lose faith in the survivor because they go back to the same situation time and time again, and that causes them to be hesitant to reach out. So remembering that, that's on us, of that judgmental piece, not being judgmental, be an advocate, be a listener. And then something that, we also took away was the whys that they reach out to family, friends, and neighbors and what they want moving forward. Those are huge pieces of your research. Thank you so much for doing all of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. And now I would like to call on our very own scientific board member, Ms. Deborah Plepler. Go ahead and unmute me. There we go.
Great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate being here and so appreciated your research, Lisa, and your presentation. We had a wonderful discussion in our group. And I'm just going to start sort of narrow and go broader because there were so many layers upon or levels upon which we had discussions. Tamara Schwartz was with us from the Child Development Institute, here in Toronto. Lena Aujamary from that institute and has done a few sessions with the Melissa Institute. Tamara runs a program for women who are out of a violent situation, but are really challenged with their children. And the program helps the mothers themselves understand the importance of regulation, the importance of ensuring that they're regulated and they can think clearly so that they can support their children in regulating. So that's something very proximal to the women and their children. Stepping beyond that, we talked about isolation and isolation for the women experiencing domestic violence who may be in the country illegally. They may be alienated. They may be incredibly fearful of going to authorities to keep themselves and their children safe, and how important it is to recognize that. We also then moved out and talked about resources that we could provide, and the fact that those resources need to be broader. So there are systems problems. For example, we tell women to check to connect with Child Protective Services, and sometimes those services are more punitive and more risky rather than protective. So we need to think about that. In Canada, and I'm sure it's similar in many places around the world, there's still so much racism in the systems, in the healthcare system, in the criminal justice system, in the social service system, and that cannot be. Every person needs to be seen and valued equally and treated equally with equal access to services. And finally, I think there needs to be some broader public initiatives. Being an active listener and non-judgmental listener actually isn't that hard. And that's what the women say they need, somebody to just be present and acknowledge their situation as a first step to feeling like they're standing in the right place, ready to move on. So that's sort of the range of issues we discussed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deborah. I just want to just make a few, if I may, responses. Oh, you're going to see my dog in the background. She just won't stay down. First of all, I just wanted to mention a paper that I just wrote with someone else on the loneliness of the survivor. And when you described the isolation, it reminded me of this paper where there's isolation, but sometimes we forget that isolation is a term that describes the outside, like there's nobody around, how that trickles into like a person's internal experience, which is loneliness, which is the most profoundly horrible feeling, to feel like that woman said, and when I quote, "I am alone in the universe. There's no one." And survivors, that we have talked to would do anything on earth to avoid that feeling. I mean, definitely going back to a harming partner, that's easy. And a lot of other things too, to avoid that lonely feeling. And just in response to what you were saying about services, I think that our services are in some ironic way systematically organized to perpetuate that loneliness. Like we do the exact opposite of bring people into community, right? We sometimes, I've worked a lot in New York State, people are not even allowed to go to a shelter in their own borough. They have to go elsewhere. So that means their children have to start new schools. And it's very, the shelters are all very concealed so that, I'm sure this is true for many of you, that children are not allowed to tell their friends where they live. Of course, they're not allowed to have people over. And of course, and then, what is the message for survivors and their children? But this is a shameful thing. This is a stigmatizing thing. And it certainly does not allow for the maintenance of the kind of connections that survivors ultimately need to stay free of abuse long after us professionals are gone and out of the picture. And so I do just want to return to, some of the, and this is the case in, that a lot of these very beautiful ideas about how we can make our own programs profoundly survivor-centered. And Robin, I think it was you, described how hard it is to, it was you, sort of to be empathic and to get it, even among staff people who work in DV organizations. But I just do want to return to how the participants point that we need to help family and friends achieve that level of non-judgmental listening capacity that we also want our staff to achieve, because ultimately we're temporary, they're not. And so no matter how beautifully we become attuned to people, we're eventually not going to be there for them. And so I think it is just so important to hear what these survivors said about building up their network members' capacity for non-judgmental listening. And remember that we are a professional organization, or professional organizations, no matter how loving we are, that are not permanent in people's lives. Except maybe this like safe families. I mean, I love the idea of remaining friends with people even after they leave the whatever house they were in. But anyway, I just want to make that clear. And I want to also just name one other study that we did of survivors' experience of systems as promoting loneliness, but also every survivor, and especially survivors of color, fear, as you mentioned, Deborah, Child Protective Service involvement. Like, everybody knows that when you talk to someone in social services, that you're talking to a mandated reporter, and that if you do nothing wrong, there was violence in the home, and that makes you vulnerable to having Child Protective Service involvement. And even if there's one thing worse than lonely, it's risking having your child separated from you. And so, I have worked with some of the most amazing programs in the Massachusetts area, who are, and in all of them, the very survivor-centered advocates talk about the tension between being empowering, delivering a message of empowerment, all while having this tremendous power over a survivor in being a mandated reporter. And everybody knows it, and no one exactly sort of talks about it fully. It's just this uneasy thing right in the middle of their attempts to be empowering. So again, another reason why survivors in that study also longed for people in their community who are not mandated reporters to be able to turn to. So just like some messages from all different angles about the need for us to remember that we need to also help people who are not us to become non-judgmental listeners. So thank you for that platform.
Oh, Juanita, there we go. Hi.
Hi. Okay, I'm Rocio. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
hear
can.
me? Oh, okay. We are from the group number 12. We had some difficulties and informing some of the details, but one of the things that as a director of En Familia, and I've been working with domestic violence also for almost 30 years and 22 years with En Familia. I strongly believe in the new collective helping transformation techniques, the new modalities. I would like to go back. Some years ago, I learned about restorative justice. And I've been hearing more and I've been learning more about it. And I think for trauma, it is an amazing way of healing for both, for the victim and for the abuser as well. So that's something that you guys put it also in your recommendations. So I will try to follow up again. And thank you so much. It's an excellent workshop.
Thank you so much, Rocio.
Peggy had her hand raised. Peggy Hold, is that how you say your last name?
Oh,
yeah.
Up here. All right. Go ahead.
Thank
Peggy.
you. I didn't want to interrupt, but I think I'm going to be stuck with this question. So, and it's actually back to the last, before Juanita spoke about how do we kind of engage those that aren't the people that are professional working, that are learning how to hold space, that are non-judgmental. The only way has to be a public health campaign, right? I mean, how else do we do it? we can knock on each door and our work can be the motto, but how it has to be a public health campaign that says, hey, this is what's happening and this is what we need. I don't know.
Peggy, I was hoping you would say something because I heard you, I saw you nodding your head very vigorously during, and I was like, you have something to say. But I just want to offer what the survivors and just sort of raise up again what the survivors in this study. And honestly, they've said it to me in so many different ways in much of the research I've done over the last 10 years. And it would be easier. Public health campaigns are really hard. And it's really hard to teach the subtleties of what it means to actually listen when we're at, well, I'll tell you about a study I'm doing right now of the mothers of adult survivors and how they think, what they do to try to be helpful and what they think non-judgmental listening means. But what these survivors said was very concrete. They said, give me an opportunity, offer an opportunity for our moms to come in to your program and meet with me. And like, can you talk to them about what it means? You know, I think it would be helpful for them to hear what it feels like to me when you give advice that I'm not ready to follow and how it makes me feel hopeless and alone. Or they said, have a group for network members. Let me pick my best friend, my sister, my brother, my pod, and exactly, and bring them together or do it over the phone or have a Zoom call or have an ongoing group of pod members separate from the survivors. Like they offered a lot of different, but it was really centered on programs. It was not about these survivors were not interested in the public health camp. They were interested, or public information. They were interested in my people. Let help my people know how to work with me. And they said over and over again, sometimes they can't hear it from the survivor because they think I'm like, what, you crazy? You're living with this guy and you're not leaving? Like, I don't trust anything else you have to say. So to hear it from, this is a role for like professional. This is a place where our voices are really important, I think, is talking to network members in these various ways. And there was disagreement. Like some people said like, oh, I want to be in a group with my mom and other survivors and their moms. And that's what I really want. Others said, no, I want to be out. I don't want to hear it. Moms need to talk to moms or with a facilitator. And some said, I just want coaching and how to talk to them, or coaching for them and how to talk to me. So there were a lot of ideas offered that I think could be implemented pretty easily, that are more direct. And I will also say that that it is very moving to this study, which kind of implies that network members stink and they say the wrong thing and they don't believe. And I was thinking to myself, mothers do as a mother who's gone through it with my 3 kids, we can look like that and not actually be like that. I want to hear from the mothers, from their perspective, what it is like to have an adult survivor in their lives, of course, to want desperately for them not to be hurting and to be trying to figure out, what role do I play? And so we have been interviewing mothers and, consistent with this study, so many of them, almost all of them that we've interviewed so far have their own trauma histories and are bringing that to how to support their child and have a little bit of a need to sort of get out from under that to think clearly. And so I think from their perspective too, it would be amazing to have a group that really honors their experience and then moves on to what would be helpful to their child. Does that make sense to you, Peggy?
I wonder, Lisa, I don't know, at the risk of sounding like I'm pathologizing the experience of victims of intimate partner violence, but while you were talking and while I was listening to conversation now, it reminded me of some of the work that is done around AA and the Al-Anon groups and the involvement of family members in the Al-Anon groups and the rich dialogues and connections and compassion and the lessons that are learned in those groups. And if any of you have not participated, they're open to everybody. So you can, I suggest you go and see what happens there. There's an affirmation of humanity often in those groups that is in part what we're talking about. So I wonder if you know anything from your experience or the research in the area that suggests that a model like that may be helpful. I am not up to date on my knowledge on the research on alcohol abuse intervention. So I know in the past the Al-Anon model was an important part of the treatment program or that approach and related to healing. But I wonder what your thoughts are of how it might work in a context like this.
I cannot wait to tell my co-authors that you thought of that, Etione, because one of them, Deborah Epstein, is obsessed with this idea of an Al-Anon for survivors' families. She's also really interested in the idea of alcoholics and, something else for survivors, a group where you can go in and out and, that sort of where nobody's going to be afraid of Child Protective Services. And it's just a bunch of struggling people trying to figure this out together. So I think that is, so if you think about, level one is what can we do tomorrow? Call the mom of the survivor and say, come in, let's talk about how you can support your person. The outside level is like public information. And then there's this campaign. And then there's this mid-level that could be something like that, just like a drop-in group for family members of survivors who have been affected so deeply, who are themselves struggling with how do I, how on earth as a mother could I just offer a listening ear, knowing that my child is going back into danger? Like, of course I'm going to give advice. Of course I'm going to say, get the hell out. Of course I'm going to say, I can't even listen to this. That would be a natural response from people who love the survivor. And yet it is not a helpful response. And so I think that there is enormous value in potentially in thinking about a model like that as that sort of mid-level between what programs can offer directly and then in a very abstract public information kind of way. I think that's such a cool idea. Let's find somebody who would fund that and run it. Let's do it. Melissa Institute.
Okay. Well, if you dream it up, we can try to make it happen. And,
excellent. I'm dreaming. Thank you.
So at this point in time, I think, Etienne, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the Community Action and Human Services Department of Miami-Dade County. I'm not sure if Yvonne is in here to speak, but maybe just a little bit of what they do.
She texted me that she listened to the presentation and she had to step out for a moment. She's in charge of many aspects of everybody who knows her in Miami knows that she's in charge of just about every program that has to do promoting safety and well-being of victims of violence. And so no, I'm okay with that, Christina. What I was thinking, given the people that we have some of the people that we have in the audience, I was wondering what are some of the systemic barriers, if you will, that they experience at their sites for the type of humanistic, life-affirming approach that you are describing, Lisa, that the victims want. Because this is not really rocket science in a sense. It's really about really being there, being present. But I also, having witnessed the rhythm of the work in many of these institutions and the high demands and the high levels of stress, I think there's a number of things that conspire against, providers of services really being ready and willing to act all the time like that. And I wonder, since there's so many other people here who lead those organizations and work in this, if they have some suggestions and some thoughts on this, as well as you, Lisa.
If I see anybody waving their hands. Would anybody like to share?
while we're waiting for people to decide that they want to talk, I just do want to say that, and I hope you will, because, you know, Tioni and I are not inside. It's the direct service people are the ones who know, and I see Charles is raised his hand, know how to take these ideas forward. But I will just say that, you know, I work with 25 programs in Massachusetts, and we've been doing research together for maybe 15 years. And I went out to dinner with a group of executive directors last week that are my friends. And I said, so we should do something together. What are your thoughts? And they said, honestly, at this moment in our organizations, what you could do, we love you. And what you could do for us is leave us alone because we are barely holding on. And that is very different than how they used to you know, pandemic, they were ready to go. But I think that there is a level of, I don't know how that sits with the people on this, in this meeting, but they described a level of burnout and difficulty hiring and, you know, record-breaking rates of people knocking on their doors that was truly heartrending. And so the idea of starting something new, and I should have said this in the beginning,
Right.
the idea of starting something new felt terrifying, or not even terrifying for some, and then like just like a joke for others. And I don't know how that, you know, how that sits with you all, but I do see that Charles has his hand raised.
All right.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so you basically said what I was going to say is that that's okay. Is that like our levels of staffing is so low that, you know, we certainly want to create that space where we can have those deep, meaningful conversations with the folks that we're working with, but our staffing level is so low that we just can't afford to do that, right? And so it's just like create that, you know, we offer them the shelter, the safety, and even for our community services, just to be able to, you know, fill out orders for protection and offer those like the bare minimum of what we think we can offer. And so, you know, it's really, really hard work, as everybody knows, and you know, the staffing levels that we have would just be, it's just not realistic right now to be able to have that much time to spend with individuals. And so, you know, it's curious around the idea of how can we leverage volunteers in a different way, maybe something like that. So that's what I would say, just from actually implementing it, because I think that's where we want to go. That's where we have done the work in the past, and sometimes we forget about that. But that's what I would talk about. I'd also just, if we have time for a conversation, I'd like to circle back around the issue around safety, if we can, at some point in time.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Charles.
Go ahead and talk about it.
Yeah.
So my question is, I agree with all this sort of premise of how, you know, we create that space and have other people involved, but there's also the realistic issue of safety and lethality in certain situations. And so how do we find that balance when we know, like in Minnesota last year, 26 people were killed due to domestic violence homicide. And so that's realistic for some people. And if you get, you know, sort of other people involved that don't understand the sort of lethality that comes along with domestic violence, how does that play into all of this conversation?
So are you talking about the, excuse me, the potential risk of having someone like come into a shelter to have a conversation?
No. I'm talking about when you create sort of these networks of people that they're using sort of non-system people, I'll put that in quotes around that, and trying to help people understand, you know, what to listen to, but also when, say, if a woman's not going into shelter or not reaching out to law enforcement, or, you know, there's just sometimes the person who's using harm is going to go to the point of killing that person. So, and then you have other people who may be trying to support that person, whether in their home or someplace else. And then you know, I'm just trying to think about how other people might be impacted or killed because of what's going on in that situation. I'm just trying to figure out how you because if you said the survivors that you interviewed, safety was not a top concern, right? am I correct in,
I didn't say that. I just said that in the moment of danger, what they felt they needed was someone to help them sort out their options and to listen.
oh, okay,
Not, it was not a top concern. I did not say that.
okay.
No, just like
Thank you for clarifying that. But I'm always trying to figure out, because when you think about how shelters are premised on is creating that safe space, and trying, because for us, whether it's the cameras and the secure doors and how we think about confidentiality and all those situations, like how do we factor all that in and trying to keep people from getting killed, basically.
Yeah, I want to address that. I think that's a fantastic question. So first of all, let me say that all of what the survivors said about what they needed was in service of safety. It is true that they did, in a different study, survivors have talked about loneliness as sometimes worse than violence. They did talk about that. But in this particular, they wanted safety was incredibly important, just so was connection. But I want to just respond to your direct question in a couple of different ways. First of all, I should say, so I mentioned in the beginning that there was a couple streams of research that fed this particular work, and one of them was a focus group study of all advocates in a small New England state. And in that study, I found that people were doing a lot of really interesting, what I'm calling network-oriented work, work to the work that you're describing is potentially dangerous, which of course it is, potentially. And so how they did it, I have a little model, and I think if that was not mentioned in the chat, I can send it to anyone who's interested. But the model that was derived from the work that advocates were doing in the state was that first they would do, and again, this does take time, so there's no shortcut, but they would do what they called pre-work with survivors. And that was really mapping out who would be a safe person in their network really carefully. That was conversation. That was not, because often the survivors had no one. So then it was sort of like, let's talk about your day. The babies, somebody at the daycare where your kid goes, they've been really interested, and you never put that person on your list. Let's talk about that. So it's very, very careful work to figure out who is your network anyway. It's not necessarily the obvious people. And then why do you think they would be safe? And it's also, why would you go back to so-and-so? They're not safe, which is probably more often the way it goes. And so there's a lot of pre-work done to be able to identify a safe person, for the survivor to be able to identify a safe person. Then there's the creation of a network. And then there is, this wasn't the case then. These were all in-person meetings or sometimes phone meetings, but we have this amazing post-COVID knowledge of Zoom. And so there's a lot of way to do a lot of the work without ever coming face to face until that becomes appropriate. But the other thing to say is that remember that most survivors seek out help from their informal networks before, instead of, and after us. So it's not like they're not going to. It's just us trying to make it safer. And there is no perfectly safe, it's just safer. So that's one set of things I have to say in response. I'd love for you to hear what you think of that. I also want to just point out, use this opportunity to mention, Etione and I had talked about maybe making this the focus of this conversation. So I'm glad to have a chance to mention it. Another study I did on open shelters. I don't know if anyone here runs what we call an open shelter, but it's in a disclosed location. It's on a street where everybody knows what it is. You often have, and there's sort of a growing movement, it's not very big still, so a lot of people haven't even heard of it, but the open shelter movement to open up shelters so that people, friends and family can come visit, can help babysit, can start a gardening club, where there's much more fluidity between the community and the survivor. And the outcomes for survivors are really pretty amazing in terms of staying connected and reducing stigma and mental health. And there's a tremendous focus on safety, of course. in the open shelter movement. And part of that safety comes from, well, there's a couple things. One, people who run these shelters say, everybody knew where our shelter was anyway. Like in this era, there is no possibility of keeping this shelter safe. So in some ways, we are just more intentional in what we do for their safety than maybe other shelters do. They have a lot of layers of gateways to get in, cameras, etc. And then they have some, sort of intake thing that they do with people who want to visit, and then they have special places where people can visit. Although eventually people can, there was one shelter where a mom moved in to help take care of the kid so that the survivor could go to work. So there's all kinds of arrangements. So that's just, I think that there's a lot that sometimes I worry that we get locked in. You know how a survivor steps on a nail at a shelter in Alabama, and suddenly all over the country, there is a new rule that people can't go barefoot in shelters. There's this thing that happens like that where we all are very protective, and then we kind of lose our flexibility in our thinking about new ways to think about safety or new ways to help people feel connected even within the shelter. So I don't know, does that begin to trigger some new thoughts? Charles, Chuck, I don't know what your name is. He's on mute. Melissa. Christina. Oh, that is.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah, and because, like our shelter, we don't hide our location, so everybody knows we're located. So that's out in the community. We have a sign out front, so that we have our name out there. So that's not hidden, and we've been that way for like 5 years, where it's not a hidden location. And so, yeah, I appreciate that thought process about how to create space within our facility that may be less, because I feel like staff, and it's been that way since I've started 9 years ago, that staff, that residents were much less, most of them, not all of them, of course, most of them were much less worried about confidentiality than we were, just about who they told, where they were at, right? And so that's always been my experience as far as thinking about confidentiality, how we think about it. So yeah, that'd be something interesting to think about as far as open shelter and who can come in and help support the women and kids who are here.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts. And I had the job to bring the conversation to an end, and we only have a couple of minutes, and I first of all wanted to thank all of you for your participation, your active involvement with this presentation and discussion. And I want to remind you to fill out the feedback survey, especially if you're requesting continuing education credits. Remember that that's the only way you get your credits. So, and you have a link that was sent to you to do that. And to you, Lisa, my heart goes out to you. I'm most appreciative that you took time of your busy life and to share all the wonderful work that you've been doing with survivors of domestic violence. And I regret not continue working with you all the time, and we had to find another way of bringing you closer to the Institute. Perhaps I will convince you to join us as a scientific advisor and do more things. Question for you, Lisa, if folks wanted to reach out to you or get in touch with you, would you like them to do it directly to you? Do you like them to do it through us? How would you?
Please feel free to email me about anything. I'd be happy to do that. And thank you so much for your attention and for spending 2 hours on this topic. I really appreciate it so much. And Etione, I would do anything for you. So count me in on your.
All right. So you saw it. She said yes. We have a new scientific advisor here on the group. Thank you very much. And to all of you, wish you a wonderful weekend. This is also, remember, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so this was a wonderful way for us to close the month. The community Action and Social Services Department has a lot of different activities through the month here in Miami-Dade. So I encourage you to go and participate and be engaged. This is a moment to really raise awareness and precisely promote this type of conversations and understanding that Lisa told us that is what victims want. So thanks again, and hope to see you in our next installment, which is coming up in what is it, Christina? In December, the first week of December.
December 9th.
December 9th, we're gonna have Dr. Annette LaGreca really speaking about how to get through the disasters, speaking about how to deal with the consequences of the storm, the Ian storm, and how to help our families work through that type of situations. All right, take care.
Thank you everyone for coming. Have a fantastic weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.